G'day guys, how's it going? Welcome to this episode of Pete's 2 Cents. This is where I answer your questions that you send me each week over on Instagram. So I'm trying to get more frequent with doing these. It has been a little haphazard, a little random in terms of when I do these over the last, few months, a year. But I'll try and get into more of a rhythm. So anyway, if you ask me a question, if you want to ask me a question, you can do so over on my Instagram. Just go find Aussie English on Instagram, give me a follow, and on Mondays I post a story asking you guys to ask me anything, and then after that I answer all of last week's questions. The last thing to remind you guys, if you're a premium podcast member or you've got access to the premium podcast through the Academy membership, the transcripts, there are no transcripts for the Pete's 2 Cents episodes. They're the only episodes on the entire podcast that don't have transcripts. There's over 1,200 episodes now on the podcast with transcripts, so if you want to read and listen at the same time, check out those episodes. These ones are for me to be able to quickly answer a lot of questions and then also obviously upload them quickly without having to transcribe them. And I can also sort of go for as long as I want, right? If I go for an hour, in order to transcribe that and write that out, it usually takes maybe 3 to 4 hours, sometimes longer. That's part of the reason there's no transcripts for these episodes. So without any further ado, let's have a look at the questions that you guys asked me this week. So I haven't answered these yet on Instagram, but I can see them all here. Okay, tell us some strong Aussie slang for when you're tired. Stuff like I'm buggered or worn out. So this one comes from Tatsuki. So good question, Tatsuki. So you can say, yeah, I'm buggered, right? This is informal slang for tired. It can also be used, I'm buggered, for I'm in trouble, right? Oh man, I'm buggered. You know, it's a stand-in, informal way of saying the F word, right? Fuck. So if you say I'm fucked, you could. That's a very rude way, a very informal way of saying you're tired, that you're injured, that you're tired, as in, yeah, you're tired, you want to sleep. It could be that you are in a lot of trouble. So buggered is a little more, it's a little politer, although it's still informal, right? So you can say that instead of the F-bomb and it's not going to get you in trouble. Worn out. So worn out is mainly for being tired. So I'm a bit worn out today. You know, it's kind of like you've done a lot of something and as a result, you are tired because of doing that thing. So if I was playing with the kids all day, I'd be worn out by the end of the day. We can use this too for talking about, say, clothing, an item that gets used up. So like if I buy some new shoes and I wear them every day for a year, by the end of the year, they're going to be worn out, right? They've been worn that entire year, and to the point where they're sort of falling apart, they've been worn out. I'm trying to think of other ways you could say this. I'm stuffed. You could say that for I'm tired. Again, that one's similar to buggered, where you could be. It's a stand-in for the F-bomb, right? It's a more polite way of saying that. So it could be used for in trouble as well. Oh man, I'm stuffed when I get home. My parents are going to be so angry. I am stuffed. We can also use buggered and stuffed for broken, right? Like if the car that you've got at home, it's broken down, you can't use it, the thing's buggered, it's stuffed, it's kaput, right? It's cactus, it's buggered, it's stuffed, kaput, cactus. But yeah, I'm trying to think of other informal ways, because you can say things obviously like I'm really tired, I'm exhausted, Aussie slang for it. I think that's probably about it that I can think of off the top of my head. There may be other ways of saying that you're really worn out or tired, but I think buggered would be the one to go for. You know, don't be afraid to use that. All right, next question. I know a lot of English words, but when I want to speak and use them, or write as well, I don't remember them. So what can you do to learn and remember and then use new vocab? I think that's what you're asking, and this one comes from Mercedes9999. So what you're asking really is, how do you get vocab from your passive vocabulary into your active vocabulary? And the difference between those two is that passive vocabulary is stuff that you understand when you hear or see it. And this happens, you know, your passive vocab is always going to be way, way, way larger than your active vocab. That's just how it is, right? Whenever you hear native speakers speak in any language, if they're speaking, they're going to be using usually a few thousand words, on any sort of day. So, and that's not just the number of words that they actually use in terms of, total number. It's the different words that they're using, the total number of different words that they're using, right? We have that kind of Pareto principle where you have this kind of, a reverse exponential curve of when it comes to vocab and words. So the 100 most common words are probably used 100 times more than the next 200 words, and then the next 1,000. It drops off really quickly in terms of the frequencies that they're used. Anyway, suffice it to say, if you're reading a book, the vocab in that book is generally going to be a lot more diverse. You're going to have a high number of words, more advanced words, everything like that in the book, as opposed to when you're speaking. Because I think when people write, they tend to have more time to think of more advanced ways of saying things. But when you're speaking, you kind of stick to the simpler expressions and words for talking about stuff. So why am I saying this? In any language, that's the case. Your active vocab is going to be probably, maybe between 2 and 10,000 words, depending on how advanced a speaker you are, whether you're a native speaker or not, how much you read, right? There's plenty of native speakers who don't necessarily have really big both vocabularies, and there are plenty of foreign speakers who learn a foreign language, of say English, who have huge vocabularies. Usually it's related to how much they read. But yeah, so you're going to have a smaller active vocab than your passive vocab because, if you're reading, if you're studying the language, you're going to get exposed to a lot more language, a lot more words, a lot more expressions than you ever use spontaneously in conversation. So I'm getting to the point. How do you end up taking the words and expressions that you learn and that you understand in your passive vocabulary and put it into your active vocabulary? Really, it comes down to studying and then using what you're studying, right? That's the only way of really doing that. You need to be learning new words or thinking about stuff that's in your passive vocab. When you're reading a book, when you're watching a TV show with subtitles, when you're listening to a podcast with transcripts, when you see certain words, phrases, expressions, certain grammar that you may not use when you're speaking in your active vocab, you need to kind of take note of it and then try and actively use that when speaking. So, a good example might be learning, say, 10 new words or 10 new expressions on a daily basis, and then trying to use them in conversation, because that's how you're going to be able to move them from passive to active vocabularies. You need to use it. Your brain needs to be shown that you have a use for this when it comes to your active vocab, because, sorry, I keep hitting the photo that I've got of my son here. If you don't use the stuff that you understand from your passive vocab, your brain, your muscle memory, all of that sort of stuff is never going to get used to actually implementing it when speaking. This is what's happened to me with my French. A good example is my French. When I first started this podcast, I was learning French like crazy. All right, if you've gone back and listened to the first few hundred episodes, you probably hear in there me talking about Français Authentique, so Authentic French, the podcast that got me started with Aussie English. The reason I started Aussie English, I was listening to his podcast a lot. I was focused on French. At the time, my French active vocab was huge comparatively, right, compared to where it's at now, because I don't speak French anymore on a regular basis. I don't have many French friends nearby that I get to chat with on a regular basis. I'm not really writing in French, I'm not chatting to anyone online in French, so I'm not using it. And so my active vocab has really shrunk. My passive vocab has as well. However, I can still watch TV shows in French, read things in French, hear people talking in French, and still follow what's being said, right? So it's use it or lose it when it comes down to it. So my point is, if you are trying to expand your active vocab, you need to be actively studying new words and expressions that you would like to use or that you hear being used when talking about topics you want to talk about, and then using them yourself until they become, subconscious. They're just used all the time when you're speaking. Hopefully that makes sense. So yeah, good luck with that. But really, it just comes down to reading as much as possible, watching TV shows, absorbing the subtitles, everything like that, and then trying to use the new stuff that you learn. That's really how you do it. And that's how native speakers would do it without ever studying, right? They're just reading a lot, then they're being sort of forced to talk about topics. Like when you go to school and you're forced to talk about topics that you've been studying, as a result of doing that, you are using all of these words and expressions and everything that you have just sort of covered. Okay, the same person, Mercedes, asks, I've heard that slang isn't really used by educated people. Is that correct? I don't think so. I don't think it's necessarily like, it may be that they use less slang, but it's going to be really context dependent. And I think most native speakers don't even realize, if they haven't learnt a foreign language and they haven't really thought about slang very much, and whether it's in English or a foreign language or whatever, quite often they'll just know the names of things and they won't realize that it's slang or not, right? Like a good example is, I think if you were to say to someone, what's the word for this? And you hold up your sunglasses, they're probably going to say, oh, they're your sunnies. But they're probably not thinking, oh, I'm using a lot of really strong Australian slang when they say something like sunnies. It's just the word that we use for them. So there are quite a few words like that in Australian English in particular, probably in any language really, where they're slang terms in that they have been sort of reduced from the original word or phrase, right? Sunglasses becoming sunnies, but they're not kind of informal, they're not rude in any way, they're just shortened words, shortened ways of saying certain things. So we've got those in Australian English, and I think people of any education are going to use those kinds of words. I'm trying to think of another one. Selfie is a good one. That's another, Australian slang word that ended up taking over worldwide online, right? On Instagram and everything, where someone's taking a photo of themselves. They're taking a self-portrait. It became a selfie. That, I think the average person wouldn't even realize that that's a slang term. If you were to ask them, well, what's the proper way of saying selfie? They probably wouldn't think, oh, it's a self-portrait or a self-photo. They'd just be like, well, the word is selfie. That's what it is. So there are loads of those sorts of words. I don't think it's correlated with education. I did, 3 degrees at university and was surrounded by really educated people studying science, and they would use these types of slang words all the time. Now what it comes down to really is the type of slang that they're going to use. There's definitely more vulgar slang terms and expressions in Australian English, and again, it'll be the same in any language, and they're the kinds of things that perhaps more quote-unquote more educated people avoid using, because, the more educated you are generally, it kind of correlates to the more formal that your language is overall. And I think that's the point you're getting to, that when it comes to education, the more time you spend at school, generally, the more your language kind of gets more advanced, but also you are kind of forced to use quote-unquote proper formal language when talking about things, right? It wouldn't be okay for me to present at a conference, talk about my PhD, and be using swear words and be using loads of vulgar slang and all that sort of stuff to describe things. That wouldn't be appropriate. So I think that's why perhaps more educated people tend to use those types of words and expressions and everything less frequently, because in the workplace or when they're studying, they're encouraged, whether openly, overtly, or not, they're encouraged not to use that kind of language. And so it sort of bleeds. What would you say? It probably takes over your language, so that when you're in informal settings, you're less likely to just suddenly switch from, your standard language to using more vulgar slang. But that being said, there are plenty of educated people who sound like, quote unquote bogans and use loads of slang and everything like that. So I guess the point is it doesn't really correlate with intelligence. It's not like dumb people use slang and smart people don't use slang. If you know what I mean. It's really context dependent, and you'd probably notice it with me. I probably use more slang on the podcast here when I'm chatting with you guys, because I'm intentionally trying to get into that mind, right? I'm trying to use it to expose you to it, whereas if I was chatting to, say, someone in the street, I might use less of it, but then again, it may depend on the person I'm talking to. If I'm talking to an elderly person, someone my grandparents' age, my grandparents are in their 90s, I'm not going to use a lot of slang. One, because they're much older than me and I'm going to try and be more polite and more formal, but also they may not understand it. So I want communication to be as quick and as clear as possible. So I'm not going to say to my nana, hey, Nana, have you seen my bloody son? He's somewhere. I can't find him. I'm not going to talk to her that way because she'd probably get upset, but she'd also be like, just speak normally. I don't understand what you're talking about, right? Even if I were to say something like, hey, Nana, let's take a selfie, she'd probably be like, what are you talking about? Like, put your phone away. So, yeah, hopefully that helps. Okay. Let's keep going. All right. So, Niha Malik asks, is it true that Aussies eat kangaroo kebabs? No offense. Mate, no offense taken. It's true. And it's not just kebabs. Australians eat kangaroo meat. So we do eat kangaroos. The reason I think it's become more popular, at least over the last few decades, is that kangaroo numbers have exploded in Australia. And I think this is a result, we've talked about it in the past on the podcast, it's a result of farming in Australia. We've cleared so much forest and woodland area so that we've got lots of grass growing so that we can then farm wild stock, right? Livestock is what I'm thinking. Geez, livestock. So animals like cows and sheep and goats, and we can have horses and donkeys, all those sorts of animals that eat, herbivores that eat loads of grass. As a result of that, kangaroos, Australia's, equivalent of livestock, those sort of large-sized herbivores, also eat that food and reproduce rapidly, and the numbers explode. So as a result, we have a lot of culling of kangaroos in Australia, where because their numbers get so out of proportion to the natural balance, we have to kill a significant number of them on a regular basis. And I'm sure a lot of people will be upset by that, but it's just how things are. I think at any one time in Australia, for just grey kangaroos, that's the most common kangaroo, there's somewhere between 25 and 50 million of those kangaroos, just that species, I believe. So that's 1 to 2 of those kangaroos per person in Australia at any one time. So yeah, there's a lot of them. There's a lot of them. And the flip side of the coin here is that the other reason they need to be culled, because they're competing, obviously, with livestock that farmers have, there's that. But also, I remember this when I was living in Canberra, there was a problem at one of the sort of wildlife sanctuary areas there. It wasn't a sanctuary, but it was like a native forest kind of area where, you could go and walk and everything. There was a huge mob of kangaroos. There was about 100 or so kangaroos that you could see there at any given day. Every now and then they had to go in and cull the number of kangaroos because if you had a relatively bad year, right, in terms of water, so it didn't rain much, maybe like we're in the El Nino now, there wouldn't be much grass growing. And as a result, there wouldn't be much food for kangaroos. And as a result, you'd have a lot of these kangaroos starving to death because the numbers were so high and there wasn't much food. And so to stop that, they would obviously need to go in and reduce the numbers so that the amount of food available was sufficient to support the number of kangaroos there. So I think there's also that aspect. If you end up with a huge population of any herbivore in a certain area, and then all of a sudden we go into a drought and there's not enough food, your alternative to letting them starve to death is culling the number so that the amount of food available can keep them alive. But yeah, so you can find kangaroo meat at the supermarkets, Coles and Woolworths. You'll find it there. It's pretty gamey, so I like it. I actually quite like kangaroo. It's red meat. It doesn't have a lot of fat. I think it's like 2% fat, so it's very lean red meat. And yeah, it's really tasty. So you can have kangaroo burgers, you can cook up steaks, you can make kebabs. There's loads of options. But it's a good meat. And the other good thing is that it's good for the environment because kangaroos have evolved, obviously, in Australia, and the environment has also evolved with them, the ecosystem, and so they don't damage the soil the same way that livestock do. So cows and horse and sheep and everything like that, they damage the soil, which means that plants can't grow, etc., etc. So yeah, it's actually better for the environment if you eat kangaroo. Long story short. But yeah, it's a bit weird. I think you get used to it, but then if someone were to be like, all right, well, you eat kangaroo, here, try some koala or try some platypus, I'd be like, what the hell's wrong with you? Like, you can't eat those native animals. Have some magpie. Okay. How do you say you've written aluminum? So this is from Ramamhana29. So the pronunciation of the way that you've spelt it is American, and they would say aluminum. I would pronounce it as aluminium. 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 So it's spelt differently too. I'm trying to think. There's an extra I in there, right? So aluminum, A-L-U-M-I-N-U-M. Aluminium is A-L-U-M-I-N-I-U-M. Aluminium. I think I'm going to answer this one in the next expression episode, actually, or one of the next ones. I've put the question down because it was a good one. And I didn't know the answer about why we have different pronunciations of this word. And when I was looking it up, apparently the guy who discovered aluminium ended up changing the way it was pronounced. So he changed the word a few times. So I think that's probably what the reason is. But yeah, it's interesting when you think aluminum, that's the American version. The emphasis is on lu, right? Aluminum. Aluminum. And everything else is kind of a schwa. Aluminum. 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 But with aluminium, you've got the emphasis elsewhere. Aluminium, it's on min, the syllable min. But you've also got fewer schwa reduced vowel sounds. So alu instead of lu, and then minium. Minium. So I think there's only one schwa in there. Aluminium. Right at the end compared to aluminum, the American version. So yeah, kind of cool, isn't it? How languages differ sometimes. Well, not even languages. The same language can have different pronunciations of words that as well have slightly changed compared to one another. So yeah. Okay, what is correct? Different to or different from? This one comes from Malu Roller. What is correct? Different to. It's different to this. It's different from this. I think you could probably use either, but the one I would go for is different from. You know, the newspaper I have here is different from that one. Different to. It's different to that. You know what? It's a bit weird saying different to. I think you might say something like different compared to this thing. Like it's different compared to, but different from this thing is different from this one. It's different from this one. Yeah, that's the most natural way of saying it. I think the reason you're probably thinking to there, it's a different preposition, but it's used in other comparative phrases. So things like compared to, you compare two things. This thing compared to this one is different from this one. Yeah, it's a bit of a pain in the butt learning preposition use in English, I tell you what. But I should add, if you want to learn these sorts of things, check out my phrasal verb course, the Effortless Phrasal Verb course, because I go through how to use, I think it's 16 of the different prepositions, you know, up, away, from, to, down, in, after words, particular verbs, obviously, to make phrasal verbs. And the key to learning these, really, it comes down to understanding the concepts. And so you can say the verb and then just attach the preposition after the verb, right? To move up, to move down, to move away from, to move to something, to move towards. Once you understand the concept of what that preposition is doing when you add it in to a phrase to make a phrasal verb, then you don't really have to like learn and memorize all these phrasal verbs. You just need to know the verbs and the prepositions and then kind of put them together to create the phrase that you want to say. And we've got a similar question here from Sav Melissa Mo. I arrived to a place or I arrived in a place. So, and the example they use is Australia. So you would use in Australia because you arrive in a country, if that makes sense. But yeah, this one can be difficult too because you can come to Australia. Whereas if you said come in Australia, that would make the meaning a little more X-rated, if you know what I mean. So yeah, you wouldn't say that. You would come to Australia, but you arrive in Australia. And then we can use, if we're talking about like a specific place, so we use in with a country, you know, we arrive in a country. When we're talking about a specific place, like say a museum or a station, you would say at. You wouldn't really use in. Unless you were talking about literally being within the station, if there was a building that you were inside of, you could say I've arrived in the station if you were talking about like literally inside of it. But more broadly, we would use at in those examples with places like museums, the beach, the station. I'm at that location. You could be on top of it, you could be inside of it, you could be outside of it, you could be under it. At just means, broadly speaking, you are there. But yeah, in terms of countries, I'm in Brazil, I'm in Australia, I've arrived in Australia, I've arrived in Brazil, I've arrived in the United States of America. We would use in when it comes to a country. Okay, let's keep going. What do we got here from Hadaz? Something I really love about Melbourne is the transport services. No need to buy a car. So obviously not a question. But yeah, well, that's one of the good things I think about a lot of Australia's cities. We do tend to have pretty good transportation. Comparatively, I think, like my wife came from Brazil and she was like, wow, public transport in Australia is amazing. And I remember being like, what are you talking about? It's awful. So it's all relative. I think I would always be like, things arrive late, it can be dangerous if it's late at night, blah, blah, blah. And my wife would just be like, you know nothing. You know nothing. Try getting the bus in Brazil. Okay. Here we go. Can you please read these? Ella and Sarah's drawings. Oh, okay. Sorry, the punctuation is not there in this question. So this one comes from Daniel. He's asking, is there an R in some parts in this phrase in terms of the pronunciation? So, yeah, there's two. Ella and Sarah's drawings. So he's using the names Ella and Sarah and then making it Ella and Sarah's drawings. So in order to link the A sound at the end of the word Ella and the A sound at the start of the word and, we can put an R sound in there to link them. So we could say Ella and, right? Ella and Sarah. Ella and Sarah. Sorry, I keep hitting this silly photo. I'm going to have to move it. Ella and Sarah. Ella and Sarah. We do that to just link things. You'll notice in Australian English, we use the R sound to do it. We use the yod, the y sound, and we use the W sound, w, depending on which vowels they are. So Ella and Sarah. I'm trying to think of a good example. Blue and black. Yeah, there you go. Blue and black. That's the W sound. And then boy and girl. Boy and girl. That's the Y sound, the yod, y, w. Yeah. So we use those three. I've done a video on it on YouTube. I've also talked about it on the podcast. And if you want to learn more about Australian pronunciation, obviously check out the Australian pronunciation course at aussieenglish.com.au/APC. And I have a lesson in there talking about the Australian R. So that is the intrusive R, where it's not in the spelling, but it comes in because of the sounds, and it links those sounds. Then we also have it, and this is funny, I blew my wife's mind the other day. She was saying something like drawings. The kids have done some drawings. And I was like, what wings? What are you talking about? You mean draw rings? And she was like, what? And I was like, the W in draw is silent. It's part of the vowel sound, like in the word law, right? You don't say law, it's just law, draw. And as a result of linking those vowel sounds, so or and then ing at the end there, draw ing, you use an R sound. Drawing. And she was like, I've been learning English for a decade and never knew that. So yeah, yes, there are some R's in that phrase. Ella and Sarah's drawings. Okay, so my voice is starting to go, so I might do one more question and then we might finish up, and I'll answer the rest of these hopefully on Instagram on Monday next week. Okay, is South Australia, does South Australia have a different accent that's more British from other states? This is something that a lot of people say, and my parents always tell me about this, but to be honest, I haven't really heard it, and I think it may be something that's associated with the older generations in Adelaide. They are said to have a more kind of British received pronunciation type accent. I don't know if it's true or not anymore. I think it's probably like that it was the case, decades ago. but it's probably dying out. And I think most people, especially now that kids have access to TV shows, the internet, YouTube, everything like that, and they're listening to people from all over Australia, let alone all over the world, I think those kinds of dialect differences, pronunciation differences are dying out a little bit. Probably everywhere, but definitely in Australia. So I think by and large, when you go to Adelaide, you're going to hear accents like mine, the general Australian accent. You'll probably hear the broad Australian accent. There are subtle differences and everything like that between different kinds. There's Indigenous accents. There's certain migrant accents that have sort of maintained themselves in certain areas around places like Sydney and Melbourne. But by and large, you have that kind of general Australian accent and then the broader Australian accent. And there's probably certain words that get pronounced slightly differently in places like Adelaide. We've got something called the trap bath split in Australia, which is the pronunciation between words like France. Some people say France. I would say France. Some other people would say France. So it's the a difference. The trap bath difference in terms of the pronunciation of that a sound. Another example is castle. I would say castle. My sister's husband would say castle. And that's weird because he's from down the road. We grew up in the same town. So I think what it really came down to is that when he was young, the first version of the word that he heard was castle. And so he kept saying castle. For me, it was castle. And so I kept saying castle, if that makes sense. So anyway, thanks for joining me, guys. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you next time. Catch you later.